Hello, friends, and welcome to episode number 3 with my former boss, Congressman Ro Khanna. I used to work for Ro when actually it was my second job out of college. I'll tell you a quick fun story about this. I was working at a hedge fund in 2013 when about 4 months into the job, I quit and I worked to help elect Ro into Congress. Worked for him for 6 years, 1 year full-time. That was 2014. And then 5 years part-time. I spent time as a political advisor to help him get elected, and then did a number of things for him on the political advocacy front, helping him with the mental health side and the economic empowerment side, and doing a number of local events with him. So I learned a lot in being with Ro while his congressional journey was just getting started. And this episode is really meaningful to me because we got a chance to step back and reflect and think. Just a couple quick notes. One is, I've admired Ro for a lot of reasons, mainly because he's always learning. And in fact, that's one of the first things that impressed me about him when I was considering whether or not to quit my job and work for Ro in 2013. I went to a fundraiser, and one of the questions he was asked, a question about tax policy or economics, and he said he was reading a book on the plane to New York City. And I've seen him. He's a reader. He constantly devours nonfiction and thinks a lot about what actual policies would move the country forward. And it's not just in nonfiction that he's been learning and reading. What I discovered in this episode was that he's learning a ton from people. There's an excerpt that I've shared on social media, but I found this to be just such a beautiful excerpt where he starts to list off members of Congress and identifies the one or two things that they do that's very unique that he's been learning from. And I find that to be a pretty powerful trait. When someone can go in and use the people around them as learning folks to learn from, there's something there to be gained. I mean, it's a powerful trait as a leader. And the second quality that I would say is very unique about Ro, he has a ton of ambition, but I'd argue just as much humility, particularly intellectual humility. He often has a deep, sharp awareness over what he knows and doesn't know. And I find that, again, to be part and parcel with his desire to learn. So I've seen this in Kat as well, and of course in Dean Noria, but it strikes me as something that came through with the Ro episode. And then a couple other notes, right? I was recording this episode while I was in a co-working space in Barcelona. He was recording this in between a lot of meetings, and it's not exactly an easy time to be a member of Congress and also be a public campaigner for the Democratic ticket. So he's always traveling, always moving around the country. The fact that we could even squeeze 20 minutes out of his schedule meant a lot to me. So did I have my mic equipment set up in Barcelona? No. Was my voice quality exactly where I wanted to be on these episodes? No. But I thought we had a lovely conversation, and I found a lot of good insights coming from the 20-ish minutes we had together. So I hope you enjoyed too. And if you like what you're listening to, follow, like, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. My first question is very personal. So I'm very close friends with Gio, and he gave me a download of the India trip. And I want to hear from you. I know your grandfather was part of a congressional delegation or a delegation to the US, and you did the reverse. What was your India trip like when you went?
It was a phenomenal experience, a moving experience for me to go on August 15th, India's Independence Day, to take a delegation, to lead a delegation as the chair of the India caucus. And my grandfather, as you mentioned, spent years in jail in the 1940s alongside Gandhi fighting for India's independence. He had come to visit my parents and had seen the capital. And so to now have his grandson, a congressman, going to India. Gio actually came on the trip with me, and being at the Red Fort to hear the prime minister talk about independence, and getting to meet the prime minister and Amitabh Bachchan, and I got to meet some of my relatives there. My Masi and Pua are still there. I got to eat some of my favorite sweets growing up. It was a great experience.
What was it like to meet the prime minister? And you met people from across the political spectrum in India, right? It wasn't just one party. What was that experience like?
The prime minister is a very charismatic figure. Obviously, he's a great orator. I've had issues in terms of making sure that he has supported pluralism, and that India remains a vibrant democracy in the traditions of Gandhi and Nehru. But he was very hospitable. We had samosa and chai with the different members of Congress, and we got to meet Jay Shankar, who was quite brilliant in his outlook on foreign policy. And so it was a wonderful trip.
I'm curious to know what you make of the recent election. I know Modi obviously won, but there was some check back to the up. There was some coalition building that he now has to do. Do you have a take on any of this?
I think it was a testament to Indian democracy that, he lost the district in Ayodhya, where he was engaged in election hype around the temple. But people there said, well, that they're going to be displaced, and it wasn't worth the religious argument. So I think you're going to see a more humbled Modi, hopefully a Modi that cares more about different coalitions and the multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy that India is. Yeah. And of course, India remains a very important ally, but if the election kind of was a testament to the Indian voter.
The question I had next was around managing opposition. I worked with you for 6 years of my formative 20s. I saw you balance different interest groups so well, right? You were courting Silicon Valley's donors while also sharing Bernie's campaign. You were owning your Hindu heritage while also calling out the dangers of Hindutva. Recently, obviously, you've been critical of the administration and their Middle Eastern policy, but you're also chairing Biden's reelection campaign, or you're part of that team. And I'm curious how you managed to hold so many opposing views or views that have tension built into each other with grace, because that seems like a skill worth building for people.
Well, you're kind to say that. I think I've always believed in the ambiguity of truth, that no one sees the full truth all by themselves, and that the best way to approach life is to understand different perspectives. That doesn't mean you don't have conviction, but to try to respect other people where they're coming from. And I try to look for that in my own personal growth and understanding. In our political environment, I think with all the divides we have, I think we need healing, we need bridge building, we need forms of reconciliation. And that's the temperamental approach that I've taken to our politics for the moment we're in.
Let me dig into that for a second. Where do you think that appreciation for truth even comes from? Because I do think there's something generational about us growing up in the social media era, people seeing factions and seeing truth as binary often. How do you think you managed to have that perspective on truth?
Well, I think a lot of it is a product of my upbringing, my parents, the humility with which I was raised, perhaps my own faith that comes to it with a sense of humility, and then my education. I mean, having studied some of the great philosophers, great thinkers, it gives you a perspective on that.
Yeah, I was saying it might be the U Chicago in you, the one who investigates and wants to know and is open to being wrong constantly. One of the things we do at Mandala, the business that I've been building, Ro, is helping people think about leadership and how they cultivate leadership. Now, you're around, first of all, you yourself are a leader, but then you're also around so many business, political, tech, sports leaders. I'm very curious to hear more about your relationship with Steve Kerr. I guess I want to step back and ask you, when you look at all these leaders, are there a few that stand out to you as inspirations for you? People that you're meeting on the day-to-day that you're like, this person thinks a certain way, I can learn from this?
Well, I mean, there's so many. Of course, Barack Obama, who I think inspired the country with a vision of what a cohesive multiracial democracy looks like. Steve Kerr is a great leader. One of the things he shared is that he played every player on the team. 15 players, he'd play them all because everyone needed to have a stake. I think Satya is a great leader at Microsoft with his humility and his understanding that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be the most effective, and that sometimes a quiet leadership also applies. I mean, those are off the top of my head.
Those are some that come to mind. I'm curious, is there anything that strikes you, particularly for the leaders who've really made an impact, strikes you as a commonality amongst them? Or are they all just different with their own templates that seem to work? Is there a denominator that people can learn from? When you look at Steve Kerr, Satya, some of the people you're talking about right now.
I think leadership is different. I think the main thing is passion for what you do, humility in terms of understanding your own limitations, and that you need a good team around you.
Yeah.
Those would be two of the things that I think are critical.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to you, which is your philosophy. If you had to identify your values as it relates to your leadership style, what are they if you had to name them?
Well, I would say hard work. I would say respect for colleagues, kindness, openness to all perspectives, analytical rigor, a depth of understanding of issues, and really clarity of thought in what one's advocating.
I'm curious if you ever think about where some of these things come from for you. So analytical rigor is one of them. You mentioned a few others, passion. If you had to study the origins of some of those things, where do they come from?
I think probably from my upbringing, from my parents, where it was expected that you work hard, that you have not just buzz, but substance behind what you're saying or your perspective. And then from my education, I was blessed with great teachers, great professors with the same kind of rigor to focus on substance more than style, and to recognize that good thinking, clear thinking is not a torrent of words. It often is brief, and it can cut to the heart of the matter. But clarity of thought, I think, and the depth of thought is key.
When you got elected, Ro, you were mentored a lot. People, mentored, or you were brought in. I remember Hal Rogers, once someone that you worked closely with, and you worked with John Lewis on the other side and marched with him on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You had people on, I guess, both sides of the aisle working with you, guiding you. When you think about the people that when you walked into the Hill, leaders that were particularly memorable, are those two the ones that come to mind? Are there others?
Well, there's so many I've been privileged to work with and learn from. John Lewis most poignantly talked about the influence that Gandhi's civil rights independence movement had on civil rights. We did an op-ed together, and I realized firsthand that this was not just something in the history books. Here was someone telling me about how Reverend Lawson brought teachings of Gandhi and how it influenced him and how it influenced King. I have been fortunate with Jim Clyburn to get a sense of politics and what it means to form relationships. I've seen Nancy Pelosi and how she interacts personally with people, how she sends flowers every time someone hosts her, and how she sends handwritten notes and cares about individuals. I've seen Bernie Sanders, who once told me, care about what young people are thinking. That's where you understand the moral sentiment and how he formed a sense of morality. And then I've learned from younger colleagues. I've been impressed with some of the younger colleagues who have made communication so much more accessible, demystified politics. So I think whatever one's doing, one has to continue to learn. And I've been blessed with a lot of people who've helped me.
I think that may be one of the things that makes you distinct, which is I don't feel like you ever stopped learning. I do feel like you always adapted. You were always learning, iterating, thinking, growing, and that never seemed to stop. You obviously have written a book on some of the learnings you've had and building resilience in parts of the country that have been left behind. I want to talk a little bit about resilience now. When you think about the word resilience, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think resilience means to have a goal and to be perseverant in pursuing that, even when you may have setbacks. And that could be a personal goal, it could be a career goal, it could be a goal for society. And of course, life is both success and failure. That's definitionally what happens in life, and everyone has their share of both. And resilience is being able to handle both. It's to handle the failures with the ability to move on and recover from them, and to handle the success with equanimity without complacency or over exuberance. And I've had both. I've had losses for Congress, multiple ones, and I've had wins. And I obviously I'm not perfect, but I've tried to take a longer view of life and the journey of life, as opposed to obsessing about a single outcome.
Yeah, I do have to ask, because I feel the self-talk part, the part of us that's narrating a story in our heads causes a lot of stress when we lose. So you've lost two elections, the 2004 and the 14 one the first one I was involved in, although we won Cupertino. What was your self-talk like, Ro, in those moments? Do you remember what you were saying to yourself when you lost the first time or the second time? Or were you seeing it as like a long-term race, or were you at that moment were you fixed on the loss itself?
Well, I was sure I was fixed on the loss. I was nervous about whether I would ever break into politics because it was a passion of mine, and one, it's normal that, for me at least, to have doubt and wonder about whether I could win, whether this was the right move, whether what would happen if I tried again and lost a third time, and what would happen to my livelihood, my career. But ultimately, I was driven by my passion of this is what I want to do. This is what I have to do. And that is ultimately why I think people say pick what you're passionate about, because it will give you the motivation and fuel for when things aren't breaking your way to continue.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's sage advice. I also think there's a texture to passion fueling your resilience. Like it's not just an emotion that comes and goes. It's what keeps you up. It keeps you persevering. I want to talk a little about stress. So you've got two kids now. I know they're both growing up, and you run 1,000,000 miles an hour. You're flying all over the country. How do you manage yourself and manage your own stress levels as you sort of sustain your energy through the day in and day out?
Well, I try to always walk, get as close to 10,000 steps in. I don't always succeed. I'm sometimes at 6,000 to 7,000, but moving around is important. I think I put the phone down when I'm interacting with family. It's important to have breaks from the phone and to focus on family and people. I indulge in good meals and conversation with friends. Will watch sports or movies to unwind. So I think it's just having a balance in life.
Do you think after you've established a certain level of success that stress diminishes or it stays the same?
I think that the stress of economic anxiety, which I fortunately never faced in severe forms, is much harder. And of course, and the stress of breaking into what you're passionate about is harder than the stress of then continuing. But people who are driven to have impact to continually have stress. If you didn't, then you weren't setting hard enough goals. And the question is, how do you deal with it, and how do you recognize ultimately that life has both ups and downs, and that's part of the journey.
I do want to acknowledge also one thing about the way you've managed your team. Last year, you guys won an award for the best workplace environment. I'm curious to dig into that. It seems like an interesting award to win on the Hill. What do you think went into that? Do you have a sense of why they picked you?
Well, we have a great team with Gio Saba and Marie Bellassari and my chief and outgoing chief and incoming chief, and we really worked on listening to every person of the team, taking their input, having a very heavy view of kindness. And I know that's cliched, but a lot of times that people aren't kind. They're yellers. They're angry, and we have zero tolerance for that on the team. We value the opinions of folks. We look in and care about people's self-growth and what they want to do, what they want to get out of it, and encourage that. And so that everyone feels that they have some sense of fulfillment in what they're doing. And I was very, very proud of us for getting that award.
Yeah, that it does sound pretty peculiar in an area where burnout is pretty high, where workplace stress can be high. So I thought that was interesting. I'm curious if you've learned a thing or two, because you end up having to have one of the things leaders struggle with most is having challenging conversations. You work with people on different sides of the political spectrum, people that are probably frustrating and less frustrating. What have you learned about how to have difficult dialogue or challenging conversations that stuck with you?
I think starting with common ground, starting with respect, starting with where you can see the world the same place, and then being direct about where the differences are, but doing it not in a prosecutorial way, but doing it in a way that is looking for some common ground, some consensus, and trying to inspire people to reach that while having accountability. I mean, you also need accountability in the approach.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I saw you do that live in certain debates. I've seen you do that pretty well. I always thought that was like a legacy of Barack Obama, and the kind of way he used to argue politically was very much find the common ground, then approach the differences. You are more direct than I think he is in political debates. I find that you're very clear in where you're different. It's someone else who's very clear that actually leads to the next question is Ray Dalio. There's a report that he wrote that said there's something like a 50% chance at a civil war. There's a bunch of other things that are unknown about our time. There's AI, political dysfunction. What advice do you have for people as they think about all the things that they can't control that seem to affect their life?
I think you have to just focus on what you can control. I don't worry too much about the unknown, and I don't make outrageous predictions that usually don't come true. Maybe they could get you bestseller books, but I think most people who are true intellectuals are humble about what they pontificate about, and they focus on what they can do on life.
Yeah, what they control, their circle of control.
No one's going to be reading Ray Dalio in 50 years. They'll be reading John Rawls or Habermas or other thinkers.
That's a good take on Ray Dalio. I want to go through a series of more targeted questions. One thing progressives get wrong about conservatives.
Well, I think that they don't care about poor people, or that they don't care about the underprivileged. A lot of times conservatives just have a different view of how to help them.
What about the flip? Conservatives get wrong about progressives.
That they don't care about the country. The progressives are sometimes some of the most patriotic people I know.
Okay, I'm going to keep rapid rounding and then we'll call it. But most surprising part about being in Congress that you didn't expect when you were elected?
The intellectual growth. You just learn so much about the country, the world, issues. I've really grown a tremendous amount.
Yeah. Favorite book you've read in the last 2 years, so recently?
I just recently read Anxious Generation, so it's a pretty good read about the role of social media in our society.
Would you support the Surgeon General's call to ban or to put a caution note on all
that? Yeah, I think that's an important step. I think the Kids Online Safety Act is more important, but I think that having some warning, it makes sense for kids.
Favorite book you read growing up?
I really liked Moby Dick. I liked The Great Gatsby. I mean, some of the classic American literature, Absalom.
Yeah. Any final piece of advice? So for people that are stepping into manager roles, stepping into leadership roles for the first time, you've obviously done this for some time now. Any final thought or piece of advice for them?
Well, I think finding your own convictions and what you're passionate about, looking at being part of a team as opposed to being hierarchical, and trying to build a culture of inspiration and respect is the best way to usually get things done.
Yeah. And with that, I'll just say thank you for your time, Ro. I had the benefit of growing up as a professional under you in my 20s, and I felt so lucky.
Well, you're doing extraordinary things. I'm looking forward to the impact you're going to have on our community, our country, our world, and I've appreciated seeing your growth, and wish you the best and hope you'll pursue public service at some point.
Thank you so much for listening to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Mandala For Us Incorporated. My name is Tarun Galagali, your host. If you have any questions, or if you ever want to reach out and learn more, I'm at Tarun, that's TARUN, at Mandala, MANDALA, FORUS.com, mandalaforus.com. So hope you reach out with any questions you may have. This show is brought to you by Mandala For Us Incorporated and is co-produced by Jim Mendes. I hope you enjoy what you're listening to, and as always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Tarun at mandalaforus.com. Take care.